Leave my hangar. Mara Ellison did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The entire private jet hangar went quiet because people had been trained to hear her whisper as an order. Caleb Mercer stayed on one knee beneath the polished white nose of her jet, his worn work jacket pulled tight across his shoulders, one hand braced on the cold concrete, the other holding a phone with a cracked screen. Beside him stood his 7-year-old daughter, Grace, clutching a paper bag from the pharmacy. "Dad," Grace whispered, "can we go now?" Inside the bag was cough syrup Caleb had bought with the last $12.17 in his checking account. He had counted it twice at the counter, then put back a sandwich so she would not see him choose between dinner and medicine. Mara saw none of that. She saw a poor single dad in scuffed boots kneeling under a $40 million aircraft on a night when donors, cameras, and executives were waiting. "Security," she said. "Get him away from my plane." Caleb looked up slowly. "Ma'am, do not move this jet," the chief pilot laughed under his breath. Mara's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Caleb pointed toward the small metal identification plate near the nose gear well. "That serial plate doesn't belong to this airframe." A few employees exchanged glances. Someone near the hangar doors smiled as if the poor man had said the moon was nailed to the roof. Mara stepped closer. "Do you know what happens?" she asked. "When a man with no clearance crawls under an Ellison aircraft and starts accusing my company of fraud?" Caleb stood, careful not to startle Grace. "I know what happens when a plane wearing a false identity leaves the ground," he said. Mara did not notice the chief pilot's smile disappear. Her pride had already chosen a side. "You were hired to replace floor lights in Hangar 2, she said. "Not to inspect my jet, not to speak to my pilots, not to embarrass me in front of my board." Grace tightened her fingers around Caleb's sleeve. "Please," Caleb said. "Call the FAA before you start the engines." Mara's mouth hardened. "I do not take safety lessons from a temp contractor who brings his child to work." The words landed harder than the insult. Caleb felt Grace flinch beside him. He looked down at his daughter, then back at the aircraft. "Then take them from the plate," he said quietly. "Because that plate is lying." Mara turned to security. "Remove him." 1 hour later, the jet would be surrounded by federal agents. Before the night was over, the name painted on its tail would become evidence, and Mara Ellison would learn that the man she threw out of her hangar had once been the youngest crash investigator on a federal response team. Caleb Mercer had spent 7 years teaching himself not to react when powerful people misunderstood him. He had learned that a calm voice frightened guilty men more than anger did. He had learned that the truth did not need to shout. And he had learned, painfully, that being right did not always bring back what had already been lost. But Grace was watching. That made the hangar feel different. 2 guards approached him from either side. They were polite men, embarrassed men, men who knew he had been working in the building since 6 that morning. One of them, a broad-shouldered guard named Dell, lowered his voice. "Caleb, don't make this harder." Caleb did not move. "Dell," he said, "you have a daughter?" The guard blinked. 2. "Would you put them on that airplane?" Dell's eyes flicked toward the jet. The aircraft sat under bright hangar lights, perfect from a distance. Its white fuselage reflected the cameras being set up for Mara's midnight departure. Gold letters along the tail read Ellison Global Air. A red ribbon had been tied near the boarding stairs for the press shot. In 20 minutes, Mara planned to fly to a medical charity summit and announce a foundation partnership that would rescue her family's reputation after a year of brutal headlines. Everything looked clean. That was the problem. Caleb had learned long ago that dangerous machines rarely looked dangerous to the people who paid for the polish. The chief pilot, Marshall Reed, stepped in front of Caleb with a tablet in his hand. Mercer, Marshall said. "This aircraft has a valid maintenance release, current logs, and a crew certified for tonight's flight. You saw one plate and decided to play hero." Caleb looked at the tablet, then at the nose gear. "Show me the airframe serial in the maintenance release," Marshall laughed once. "No, then read it." Mara crossed her arms. "Marshall, do not entertain him." Caleb kept his eyes on the pilot. "First 3 digits." The pilot's smile thinned. Grant Vale, Ellison Global Air's operations director, pushed through the group with a phone pressed to his ear. His tie was too tight, his smile too fast. "Mara," he said, "the donors are already watching the live feed. We have to board in 10. "We will," Mara said. As soon as this man leaves, Grant's eyes landed on Caleb, then on the small cereal plate beneath the nose. For the briefest second, something moved across his face. Not confusion, recognition. Caleb saw it. He had built a career around seeing the blink that came before a lie. Grant turned smoothly toward security. "Get him out," he said. "Now." Grace's voice trembled. "Dad, it's okay. We can go." Caleb crouched and zipped her coat to her chin. "Listen to me, Bug," he said softly. "When grown-ups are scared of the truth, they act like the truth is rude. But they're mad. I know. Are you mad?" Caleb looked at Mara, at Grant, at the jet, at the red ribbon waiting to make an unsafe machine look ceremonial. "No," he said. "I'm done being scared." Dell touched Caleb's arm. Caleb allowed himself to be guided back from the jet, but before they moved him away completely, he raised his cracked phone and took one photograph of the cereal plate. Grant snapped, "No pictures." Caleb lowered the phone. "Then you shouldn't have put a lie where anyone could read it." Mara stepped close enough that only he, Grace, and the nearest guards could hear her. "You don't know who you're talking to." Caleb gave her a tired half-smile. "That's what worries me," he said. "You don't know who you're flying with." Her expression sharpened. "Out." The hangar doors opened to the wet service road beyond. Cold air swept in, carrying the smell of rain and jet fuel. Dell walked Caleb and Grace through the side exit, away from the lights, away from the donors, away from the aircraft Caleb could not stop looking at. Behind them, Mara's team tried to restart the evening like a song after a skipped note. The ribbon was retied. The cameras were adjusted. The pilots returned to their checklists. Someone told a reporter there had been a minor facilities issue. Caleb stood under the awning outside Hangar 1 while Grace coughed into her sleeve. He opened the pharmacy bag, measured medicine into the plastic cup, and held it for her. "Is the plane really broken?" she asked. Caleb looked through the glass wall. He could see Grant speaking with Marshall now. Grant's hand was chopping the air in short, sharp movements. Marshall shook his head once, then looked toward the nose gear. "The plane may not be broken," Caleb said. "That's the dangerous part," Grace frowned. "I don't understand. Sometimes the part that kills people is not the engine. It's the paperwork that says the engine is safe." She swallowed the medicine and made a face. Caleb smiled despite himself. "You always make the worst flavors sound important," she said. "They are important. Mom used to say cherry medicine tastes like a melted crayon." The smile left him, but gently. She did. Grace leaned against him. It had started at 8:43 p.m., while Caleb was replacing a burned floor light near the east service bay. A sharp metallic sweetness drifted under the ordinary fuel smell. Not strong. Not enough for a pilot walking past with coffee to notice, but Caleb had frozen with the light cover in his hand. Hydraulic mist heated on a surface that should not have been hot. He followed the smell toward Hangar 1 and heard the auxiliary power unit spool up. The pitch was wrong. A fraction high, a thin tremor hiding inside the whine. He had heard that sound once before in a recording recovered from a corporate crash in Wyoming. The final report had taken 14 months. The public summary had used careful language. Caleb remembered the private truth. Wrong part. Right paperwork. Dead people. He had walked toward Mara's jet before he knew he had decided. Now, outside in the rain, he enlarged the photograph on his phone. The serial plate glowed under hangar light. 3 tiny things were wrong. The rivets were soft set, not factory security rivets. The etched letters had microscopic wavering around the 4th digit, and the manufacturer line used a spacing convention that had not existed when the aircraft was built. Caleb's thumb hovered over a contact he had not used in almost 5 years. Sandra Pike. Federal Aviation Administration, Enforcement Investigations. The last time Sandra had called, she had said, "You can leave the job, Caleb. You can't leave what you know." He had not called her back. Grace looked up at him. "Dad?" Caleb stared at the hangar. Through the glass, Mara Ellison stood beneath the wing of her jet, surrounded by people who had every reason to protect her comfort and no reason to question the machine. "Get in the truck," he said. "Are we leaving?" "Not yet." Grace's eyes widened. "Are you going back in?" "No." Caleb pressed Sandra's number. The call rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered, older, wary, awake. "Mercer?" Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. "Sandra," he said, "I need you to look at a serial plate." Sandra did not waste time pretending she was not surprised. "Send it," she said. Caleb did. He attached the photograph, added the tail number painted on the aircraft, and typed 3 words beneath it. "Plate looks forged." Then he added 2 more. "Immediate departure." The reply came in less than a minute. "Call me." Caleb answered before the first ring ended. "Where are you?" Sandra asked. "Ellison Private Field, North Service Hangars." A pause. "The Mara Ellison aircraft?" "Yes. You have eyes on the airplane? Through glass? You touched anything?" "No. You still have your badge?" Caleb looked down at the toolbox in the back of his old pickup. "Not on me. That was not the question." Rain ticked against the truck roof. Grace sat in the passenger seat with her seatbelt on, coloring the back of the pharmacy receipt with a stub of blue pencil. "I have it," Caleb said. Sandra exhaled. "Tell me what you saw." He told her only facts. He did not tell her Mara had humiliated him. He did not tell her his daughter had been there for every word. He did not tell her the insult had hit the part of him he had spent years trying to bury. He described the plate, the rivets, the etched spacing, the heated hydraulic smell, the apu pitch. He described Grant Vale's reaction when he saw Caleb take the photo. Sandra listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "The painted tail number belongs to a clean registry. Charter capable. No open flags. Pull the airframe serial from the registry history." Keys clicked on her end. Caleb watched Mara step onto a small platform in front of the cameras. She had the kind of posture old money taught before children learned humility. Chin level. Shoulders relaxed. Smile precise. She could make a hangar look like a boardroom simply by standing in it. Mara Ellison, taking over Ellison Global Air after her father's stroke, promised the board she would modernize without losing control. The reporter said into a camera. "Tonight's private flight marks the beginning of her new medical transport initiative." Grace looked up. "Is she famous?" "To people who read business magazines," Caleb said. "Do you?" "No. But you know who she is." "I know what her name painted on a jet means." "What?" "It means people stop asking hard questions because they're afraid to lose access." Grace considered this with 7-year-old seriousness. "Like when Nolan says the principal's son didn't break the window because his mom bought the playground?" Caleb looked at her. "Exactly like that." Sandra came back on the line. "Caleb." He heard the change in her voice. "The registry serial and your photo do not match." His hand tightened around the phone. "How far off? Not a typo. Different production block." He looked toward the jet. "Then that airframe is not who it says it is." "I am sending a field team," Sandra said. "But listen to me carefully. You are not deputized. You are not on duty. You do not confront anyone. I already did." "Of course you did." Caleb almost smiled. Sandra continued, "Can you delay the departure?" "They removed me." "Can you get back inside?" "Maybe. But my daughter is with me." That silenced her for a beat. "Then keep her safe first. I am, Caleb. I am." Inside the hangar, Mara began speaking to the press. Her voice carried faintly through the glass and rain. "My family built its name in aviation," she said. "Tonight, we use that name to connect critical care with the children who need it most." Applause lifted beneath the lights. Caleb watched Grant stand just behind her left shoulder, clapping a fraction late. Mara believed she was controlling the room. She did not see that Grant's eyes kept sliding toward the service doors. Mara Ellison had inherited jets, employees, lawsuits, expectations, and enemies. Her father had trusted mechanics because he had started as one. Mara trusted reports because reports could be audited, stamped, archived, and used in court. She had spent her adult life being underestimated by men who smiled while waiting for her to fail, so Caleb's warning sounded like another man trying to make her small in her own hangar. That was her blind spot. She could recognize arrogance in a tailored suit, but not truth in a stained work jacket. Caleb ended the call with Sandra and looked at Grace. "I need you to listen very carefully." Her pencil stopped moving. "Are we in trouble? Not if we do this right. What are we doing? We are going to give someone powerful one more chance to make the right choice." Grace blinked. "The lady who yelled?" "Yes! Why?" "Because if she is wrong, being embarrassed might save her life. And if she is mean again? Caleb looked toward the aircraft. Then the truth will have to arrive wearing a badge. He stepped out into the rain, opened the back of the truck, and lifted the old toolbox. The hinges squealed. Beneath wire strippers, a multimeter, and a roll of electrical tape lay a folded piece of cloth. He unwrapped it. The badge was duller than he remembered. Grace leaned forward from the passenger seat. "Is that yours?" It was. "Why don't you wear it?" "Because some things cost too much to carry every day." She did not fully understand, but she understood his face and did not ask again. Caleb put the badge in his jacket pocket without clipping it where anyone could see. He was not going back in as a hero. He was going back in as a father who knew what happened when people ignored small evidence because it interrupted a perfect evening. At the side door, Dell stood with another guard. "Caleb," Dell said, "don't do this." Has the crew started boarding? Not yet. Good. Mara said, "If you come back, I am supposed to call county deputies." "Call them." Dell stared at him. Caleb leaned closer. "And when they arrive, tell them there may be a federal aviation violation involving a falsified serial plate." The second guard shifted. Dell swallowed. "You serious?" "I have never been more serious in your building." Dell looked through the glass at the aircraft. "You got proof?" Caleb held up the phone, but he did not hand it over. Enough to make an honest person pause. Dell studied his face, then looked past him at Grace in the truck. "Your little girl, okay?" "No. She is tired, hungry, and she heard a billionaire treat her father like trash." Dell's jaw tightened. "Give me 1 minute," Dell said. "I don't have 1 minute? You want the door opened or not?" Caleb waited. Inside, Dell spoke into his radio. The other guard watched Caleb with the uneasy expression of a man realizing the world might be more complicated than his orders. Through the glass, Grant checked his phone, then whispered to Marshall. Marshall shook his head. Grant's expression hardened. He turned and walked quickly toward the maintenance office. That bothered Caleb more than the plate. Men who had nothing to hide did not run toward paper when warned about metal. The side door clicked. Dell opened it 6 inches. "I am not seeing you," he said. Caleb looked back at Grace. "Stay in the truck. Lock the doors. If anyone asks, call me." Grace nodded, scared but brave. He entered the hangar. Sound changed immediately. Rain became distant. The electric hum of wealth returned. Camera lights. Polished shoes. Glasses clinking at a temporary hospitality table. A string quartet recording playing too softly under the mechanical breath of the jet. Caleb moved along the wall, not toward Mara, not toward the cameras, but toward the maintenance office where Grant had disappeared. A young mechanic stepped into his path. "You're not allowed in here." Caleb read the name stitched on his shirt. "Tony." "Tony, did you inspect the nose gear plate today?" "No." "Who did?" Tony hesitated. Director Vale signed off the final walk-around with Marshall. "Maintenance? Outsourced. To whom?" Tony's eyes moved toward the office. Caleb lowered his voice. "I am not here to get you fired. I am here because that aircraft may be illegal to fly." Tony's face changed. "My cousin was on a bad charter once," he whispered. "Landing gear issue. He won't get on small jets anymore. Then help me keep everyone off this one." Tony swallowed and stepped aside. In the office, the lights were on. Grant stood over a shred bin, feeding papers through in fast strips. Caleb reached the door and knocked once. Grant spun. For a moment, both men said nothing. Then Grant smiled. "You have a talent for trespassing." Caleb looked at the shredder. "And you have a strange way of preparing for a charity flight." Grant's smile stayed in place, but his eyes emptied. "You are confused, Mr. No. No." "I was confused until I saw the plate. Now I am curious. Curiosity gets poor men sued." Caleb stepped into the office. "So does falsifying aircraft identity." Grant turned off the shredder. "You have no idea what you are saying." "I know the plate on that jet does not match the registry. I know the rivets are wrong. I know the Apu wine suggests a part substitution in the auxiliary bay. I know your first instinct was to destroy paper." Grant's hand moved toward his phone. Caleb did not move. "Call whoever you want," he said. "But if you call Mara, tell her the truth before the FAA does." The word FAA landed like a dropped wrench. Grant's face went still. There it was, the blink before the lie. Grant straightened. Mara Ellison will bury you. Maybe. Your name will be mud in every hangar in this state. It already was once. Grant frowned. Caleb stepped closer to the desk. You don't recognize me, do you? Grant looked him over with contempt. Should I? No, Caleb said. People like you only remember men in suits. Grant's phone buzzed. He glanced down. Caleb saw the message preview before Grant turned it over. Get him out before field team arrives. Caleb's voice lowered. Who warned you? Grant lunged for the phone, but Caleb had already seen enough. From the hangar floor, Mara's voice rose over applause. Tonight, we prove that aviation can still carry trust. Caleb looked toward the jet. Not with that airplane, he said. Grant moved first, not toward Caleb, but toward the office door. Security! He shouted. He is in here! Caleb did not chase him. He picked up the half-fed sheet, still sticking out of the shredder, and pulled it free. Most of it was gone. Enough remained. A maintenance transfer form. A partial vendor name. A serial line with the first 4 digits visible. And at the bottom, where a signature should have been, a scanned mark printed slightly too dark. Caleb held it under the desk lamp. The signature belonged to Marshall Reed, or it was supposed to. He had seen forged aviation signatures before. They all tried to look confident. They pressed too hard into the page. Real signatures made by tired professionals had rhythm. Fake ones had fear. Caleb folded the torn page and put it in his pocket. Grant reappeared with 2 guards Caleb did not know. That man stole company property, Grant said. Caleb lifted both hands away from his body. I have a torn piece of a maintenance document that your director tried to shred after I challenged the aircraft identity. One guard looked at Grant. Grant barked, "Search him." Touch me, Caleb said calmly, and explain to federal investigators why you removed evidence from a potential aircraft fraud scene. Both guards stopped. Grant's face reddened. You are not a federal investigator. Caleb did not answer. That was when Mara entered the office. She filled the doorway like a verdict. Behind her stood Marshall, Dell, Tony, and 2 board members who looked offended by the existence of anything they could not control. The press had not followed, but curiosity had begun to spread across the hangar floor. Conversations died in pockets. People leaned toward the office without admitting they were listening. Mara looked at Caleb's raised hands, Grant's flushed face, and the shredder. Her eyes flicked once to the paper strips inside the bin. Why? She asked slowly. Is everyone standing in my maintenance office? Grant recovered first. Because this contractor broke in and is stealing confidential records, Caleb said, because your director is hiding the identity of your aircraft. Mara turned to him. You do not get to accuse my people because your pride was wounded. My pride is not in the air tonight, her expression tightened. Your daughter is outside in the rain because you chose to create a scene that hit him. He let it. Yes, he said. And if I am wrong, I will apologize to her first, then to you. Mara held his eyes. And if you are not wrong? Caleb took the torn page from his pocket and held it out. Then your aircraft may be evidence in a federal case, Grant snapped. Do not take that. Mara looked at Grant. The room cooled. It was the first time Caleb saw doubt touch her face. Mara, Grant said, softer now, he is manipulating you. This man is nobody. He was replacing lights. Caleb almost let it pass. But Grace's hand on his sleeve was still in his mind. He said, nobody is not an argument. Mara took the paper. Grant's jaw flexed. Marshall leaned in, reading over her shoulder. His face lost color. That is not my signature, Marshall said. Everyone turned. Grant's voice sharpened. Marshall, the pilot stepped back from him. I did not sign that. Mara stared at the page. This is a transfer authorization, Caleb nodded, for a component swap. What component? Enough of one line is missing that I cannot prove it from this piece. But the APU tone is wrong, and the serial plate suggests more than a component problem. Marshall looked sick. I signed the release based on the maintenance packet Grant provided, Grant said. You signed because the aircraft was airworthy. Was it? Caleb asked. Grant glared. You are not part of this. No, Caleb said. That is exactly how this happened. Everyone who asked a question was made not part of this. The words seemed to strike Tony, who stepped forward. I saw the plate changed, he said quietly. Grant whipped around. Tony! The young mechanic swallowed, but he did not retreat. 2 nights ago. Hangar 3. I thought it was cosmetic. Director Vale said the old one was corroded and already documented. Mara's face went pale under the hangar lights. Why didn't you tell me? Tony looked at the floor. Because the last mechanic who challenged a vendor invoice got transferred to nights in the storage bay. Mara's eyes moved to Grant. Grant raised both hands. Mara, listen. This is becoming hysteria. The plane is safe. The paperwork is complex because the aircraft came through multiple holdings after your father's restructuring. There are clerical issues. That is all, Caleb said. Clerical issues do not require a shredder. Grant's mouth closed. From outside the office, a reporter's voice floated in. Says? Ellison? Are we still departing? Mara looked toward the hangar, where donors waited under lights and the jet sat like a promise. Caleb could see the calculation happening. The board, the cameras, the public humiliation, the charity flight, the stockholders, the headlines, the inheritance she was trying to prove she deserved. He understood why people ignored evidence. Evidence always arrived at an inconvenient time. Mara folded the torn paper. Marshall, she said, delay boarding. Grant stepped toward her. Mara, no, she cut him a look. Do not tell me no in my hangar. For 1 second, Caleb thought the night might turn. Then Grant changed tactics. Mara, he said, voice low, urgent, intimate enough to remind everyone how long he had stood beside her family. If you delay publicly because of a contractor's theory, every outlet here runs with it. The board panics. The donor summit collapses. Your father's enemies use it to call you unfit. We have spent months rebuilding confidence. Do not let him take that from you. There it was. Not facts. Fear. Mara looked back at Caleb. What exactly do you want? Ground the aircraft until the FAA field team arrives. Grant laughed. Convenient. He says federal agents are coming, but only if we wait long enough for him to look important. Caleb pulled out his phone. No signal inside the office. Concrete and metal swallowed everything. Grant saw it and smiled. Problem? Caleb looked to Dell. Can you get my daughter from the truck and bring her inside the security vestibule? Not the hangar floor. Somewhere warm. Dell nodded immediately. Mara's expression shifted, but she said nothing. Caleb turned back to her. I want you to call FAA enforcement from your own phone. Not through Grant, not through the company lawyer. Direct, Grant said. Absolutely not, Mara looked at him. Why? Because you never speak to regulators without counsel, Caleb said. If the aircraft is clean, the call protects you. Mara's thumb hovered near her phone. Grant's voice softened. Mara, your father trusted me. Her face hardened in pain. Do not use my father. He stepped closer. I protected this company while he was in the hospital. And did you protect me? She asked. Or protect what I was not supposed to see? Grant did not answer fast enough. Caleb felt the room change. Marshall looked toward the aircraft. Tony looked toward the floor. Dell returned with Grace wrapped in Caleb's spare jacket. She came in quietly, eyes wide at the polished room and angry adults. Mara saw her and, for the first time, looked ashamed. Grace went straight to Caleb. Are they still mad? Caleb put an arm around her shoulders. Some of them. Mara lowered her phone and met Grace's eyes. I should not have spoken about you that way, she said. Grace hid slightly behind Caleb. Caleb did not rescue Mara from the silence. Mara accepted that. She deserved it. Then alarms chirped softly from the hangar floor. Marshall turned. Apu temperature caution, he said. Grant snapped. It flickers sometimes. Caleb's eyes went to the jet. The sound had changed. The thin tremor was now a rough, rising vibration beneath the whine. Shut it down, Caleb said. Marshall was already moving. Grant grabbed his arm. Do not make this public. Marshall pulled free. I am the pilot in command. He ran toward the aircraft. The office emptied after him. On the hangar floor, donors stepped back as Marshall climbed the stairs, entered the cockpit, and reached for the controls. The Apu wine dipped, caught, then surged with a metallic cough. People looked around, nervous now. The reporters smelled a story. Mara walked fast, Grant beside her, Caleb following with Grace held behind him. Marshall appeared at the aircraft door. "It is not responding cleanly," he called. "Shutdown command delayed." Grant's face went gray. Caleb's voice cut through the rising panic. "Emergency power isolation panel. Left service bay." Marshall froze. "That panel is locked." "Tony," Caleb said. Tony was already running with keys. Mara turned to Caleb. "How do you know that?" Caleb kept his eyes on the aircraft. "Because that layout was used in the accident that made the manufacturer redesign the panel," Grant whispered. "No," Caleb heard him. Mara did too. The APU coughed again. Not an explosion. Not a disaster. Just enough ugly sound to strip the illusion of safety from the room. Tony unlocked the left service bay. Marshall pulled the isolation handle. The whine wound down in a rough spiral until only hangar ventilation remained. Silence hit hard. Then, through the open hangar doors, blue and white strobes washed across the wet concrete outside. A black federal vehicle rolled to a stop. Then another. Sandra Pike stepped out in a dark coat, followed by 2 FAA enforcement agents and a technical inspector carrying a sealed case. Caleb exhaled. Grace looked up at him. "Are those the truth badges?" she whispered. Caleb, for the first time that night, almost laughed. "Something like that." Grant backed one step away from the aircraft. Sandra walked into the hangar, eyes taking in everything. The jet, the crowd, the cameras, the pale heiress, the operations director trying not to run, and Caleb Mercer standing in a work jacket with a child at his side. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Mara's eyes snapped to Caleb. Not Caleb, Mr. Mercer. Sandra held out her hand, and her expression revealed nothing to the crowd. "Thank you for the call." Grant turned and moved toward the rear exit. Dell stepped into his path. "Director Vale," Dell said, "I think you should stay." The hangar became a courtroom without a judge. Donors still held coffee. Cameras still pointed at the ribbon. But Truth had entered the room wearing federal badges, and no one could mistake the shift. Sandra Pike faced Mara. Ellison, I am Sandra Pike with FAA Enforcement Investigations. We are issuing an immediate hold on this aircraft, pending verification of identity, maintenance records, and component traceability." Mara's voice came out controlled. "Is the aircraft unsafe?" Sandra did not soften the answer. "We do not yet know what the aircraft is. That is the first problem." A murmur rolled through the hangar. Grant stepped forward. "This is unnecessary. Ellison Global Air will cooperate through counsel, but you cannot seize a private aircraft on the word of a disgruntled contractor." Sandra turned to him. "No, Mr. Vale. We can seize it on probable evidence of a falsified airframe identification plate, mismatched registry data, attempted destruction of maintenance documents, and an active mechanical irregularity observed before departure. The contractor's word got us here. The evidence is why we are staying." Mara looked at Caleb. He did not enjoy the look on her face. It was too raw for satisfaction. Beneath the armor was not a villain. It was a woman realizing the palace she guarded had doors she had never checked. The technical inspector knelt beneath the nose gear with a light and magnifier. "Photographing plate," he said. Another agent ran a scanner over the etched metal. The machine beeped twice. "Surface disturbance around plate," the agent said. "Non-standard fasteners." Sandra looked at Caleb. "Tell me what drew your attention." Caleb kept his voice steady. "APU pitch first, then heated hydraulic odor. After that, the plate. The 4th-digit etching is too shallow. The spacing matches a newer template. This airframe predates that template. The rivets are soft-set replacements. Factory plates on this model use tamper-resistant fasteners." The inspector glanced up. "He is correct." The crowd reacted before anyone could stop them. Grant said, "Clerical errors happen during restructuring." Sandra nodded to Agent Lorne. "The registry serial associated with the painted tail number traces to an aircraft stored in Nevada pending teardown 18 months ago," Lorne said. "No legal transfer connects that airframe to the aircraft in this hangar." Marshall Reed stared at Grant. "You told me the Nevada aircraft was only a paperwork shell." Grant's eyes flashed. "Be quiet." Marshall stepped forward. "No." The word was small, but it carried. Sandra held up the torn document. "Captain Reed, did you sign this transfer authorization?" Marshall read it once. No, that is not mine. Tony raised a shaking hand. I saw the plate changed 2 nights ago. Director Vale said the old one was damaged and already documented. I asked why the fasteners looked wrong. He told me if I wanted to keep my job, I should stop trying to be an engineer. Grant laughed coldly. A junior mechanic and a temp electrician are now aviation experts? Sandra's gaze moved to Caleb. Mr. Mercer, for the record, state your previous role. The Hangar went still. Caleb felt Grace's hand find his. He did not want the title back, but the truth was bigger than his discomfort. My name is Caleb Mercer, he said. I formerly served as an accident investigator assigned to Federal Aviation Field Response and Enforcement Support. I resigned 5 years ago. Mara stared at him. You were FAA. I worked with them. You let me throw you out. Caleb looked at the jet. I was trying not to let you take off. Sandra stepped between them. Mr. Vale, we need all maintenance packets, vendor contracts, component transfer records, and communications related to this aircraft. Grant's smile came back, thin and desperate. Through counsel. We have a preservation order, Sandra said. County deputies are outside to assist with securing records. Mara finally faced him fully. Grant, she said, what did you put in my hangar? He pointed toward the cameras. I saved your company. Your father left debt, lawsuits, dead assets, and a board demanding clean numbers. You wanted miracles. I made the fleet look clean. Mara's face drained. How many aircraft? Grant stopped. The silence answered before paper did. Sandra signaled to her team. Secure the aircraft. The inspector placed a red federal hold tag over the jet's entry door. It looked small against the polished white paint, but it had more power than every donor speech in the hangar. Agent Lorne read the notice. By authority of Federal Aviation Enforcement, this aircraft is grounded and seized pending investigation into suspected falsification of identity markings, component traceability violations, and related maintenance record fraud. Reporters spoke into microphones. Board members stepped away from Grant as if fraud were contagious. Marshall sat on the bottom stair. Tony wiped his eyes, ashamed and relieved. Mara stood alone beneath the wing of her own aircraft. She walked to the nearest camera. Her communications director grabbed her arm. Do not, Mara removed the hand. My name is Mara Ellison, she said. Tonight, I was warned by a man I dismissed. I ignored him because I believed status made him less credible than people on my payroll. I was wrong. This aircraft will not fly tonight. If any part of my company operated with falsified records, I will cooperate fully with investigators. The Medical Transport Initiative is suspended until every aircraft connected to it is independently verified. A board member hissed. Mara, she turned on him. Would you rather put donors in the sky on a lie? He had no answer. She looked back at the cameras. And I owe Mr. Mercer and his daughter an apology. Grace pressed closer to Caleb as Mara walked over, stopping far enough away not to crowd the child. Grace, she said, I spoke about you as if you were a problem. You were not. You were a little girl standing beside her father while he tried to prevent a terrible mistake. I am sorry. Grace looked up at Caleb. He nodded once, letting her decide. It's okay, she whispered. Mara shook her head. Not yet. But thank you for being kind. Then Mara looked at Caleb. Caleb, I am sorry. Not because you were formerly federal. Not because you were right. Because I should not have needed either of those things to listen. That was the first sentence all night that made Caleb believe her. Apology accepted, he said. Grant was not dragged out. It was not that kind of ending. 2 deputies escorted him from the maintenance office after his phone and access cards were secured. When he passed Caleb, he whispered, You have no idea what you started. Caleb answered softly, I know exactly what I stopped. After the cameras left, Caleb sat with Grace near the service exit while the seized jet stood across the hangar with the red tag on its door. A rectangle of paper had done what wealth could not do. It had stopped a lie from taking off. Mara approached without assistance. May I sit? She asked. Grace shrugged. Mara sat a respectful distance away. Are all planes scary? Grace asked. Caleb put an arm around her. No, planes are honest if people are honest with them. Mara looked down. And if people are not? Then the sky finds out. Mara swallowed. Caleb, Ellison Global Air needs to be rebuilt from the floor up. I would like you to advise the independent safety review. No, he said. I will give a statement. I will help Sandra. But I will not become your shield in front of the board. That's fair. Caleb looked at Tony, who was speaking with an FAA inspector and standing taller than before. Start with him. He told the truth when it could cost him. Build a system where the person with the smallest paycheck can stop the largest aircraft. Mara listened as if writing it into herself. One meeting, Caleb said, with your mechanics. No cameras. Pay every hourly employee who attends. Done, Mara said. As policy, Caleb added. As policy, outside, the rain had stopped. Caleb gathered Grace's coat, the pharmacy bag, and the old toolbox. Before he closed it, he looked at the cloth-wrapped badge inside. For years, he had treated it like a wound. Tonight, it felt different. Not healed. Just no longer in charge of him. At the side door, Grace turned to Mara. Are you still rich? Caleb closed his eyes. Grace! Mara answered seriously. Yes! Then you should buy better screws. For the first time all night, Caleb laughed. Mara did too, softly, with tears still in her eyes. I will, Mara said, and better people to question them. Caleb buckled Grace into the old pickup. She was asleep before he finished. Mara stood under the awning. What will you tell her tomorrow? She asked. The truth. Which part? That being poor does not make you small. Being powerful does not make you right. And when something sounds wrong, you don't walk away just because the room is expensive. Mara nodded. I needed that lesson. You are not the only one. He started to climb into the truck, then paused. Mara, do not spend tomorrow proving you are innocent. Spend it finding out who was not protected. The mechanics, she said. The pilots. The passengers. The people who signed things because someone made them afraid. The truth is not just the plate. It is the silence around it. I will. Caleb believed she wanted to. Whether she would when lawyers, board members, and fear returned was her next test. Dignity did not require him to control her choice. Only his own. He drove away at 2:17 in the morning with a sleeping child, an empty gas tank warning, and a toolbox that felt lighter than it had in years. At the exit gate, Dell handed him a white catering bag. For Grace. And you. Don't argue. Rich people already paid for it. Caleb accepted it. Thanks. Behind him, federal lights washed across the hangar walls. The jet remained grounded, its false identity exposed, its polished silence broken. In the passenger seat, Grace stirred. Dad? I'm here. Did the plane fly? No. Good. She slept again. By morning, the headlines would call him a hidden expert, a former investigator, a quiet hero. They would use words too big for what had really happened. A tired father had smelled something wrong. A child had watched him stand still. A powerful woman had chosen truth over pride. And a plane that should never have left the ground stayed exactly where it belonged. For Caleb Mercer, that was enough.